The night Jimi Hendrix told his rival, "I'm better than you'll ever be." The smoke-filled room, the Café Wa, in Greenwich Village was packed to the rafters on that humid August night in 1966. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the sweet, pungent smell of marijuana, creating a hazy atmosphere that seemed to blur the line between reality and dream. Bodies pressed against each other in the cramped basement venue, sweat dripping from the low ceiling as the house band finished their set to scattered applause. Jimi Hendrix sat in the back corner, nursing a warm beer and watching the stage with those intense, dark eyes that seemed to see through everything. He'd only been in New York for a few months, having arrived from London where he'd been making waves with his revolutionary guitar work. But tonight, he wasn't here to play. He was here to watch. And more importantly, he was here to confront. Randy "Lightning" Morrison had been the talk of the village for the past year. A white guitarist from Connecticut with long blonde hair and an ego to match his considerable talent. Morrison had built a reputation as the fastest, most technically proficient player in New York. He could play Clapton's solos note for note, replicate Jeff Beck's most intricate runs, and add his own flashy embellishments that left audiences gasping. Club owners loved him. Other musicians feared him. And he knew it. Morrison had made it clear in interviews and after-show conversations that he considered himself the king of the New York guitar scene. When word started spreading about this wild-looking black guitarist who played with his teeth and set his guitar on fire, Morrison had laughed it off as gimmickry. Circus tricks, he'd called it in an interview with the Village Voice. Real guitarists don't need theatrics. They let their playing speak for itself. The comment had made its way back to Jimi through the tight-knit musician grapevine. He'd said nothing publicly, but those who knew him could see the fire building behind his quiet demeanor. Jimi Hendrix didn't respond to challenges with words. He responded with his guitar. Tonight, Morrison was headlining at the Café Wa, and Jimi had come to see what all the fuss was about. As Morrison took the stage, the crowd erupted. He was undeniably charismatic, with his flowing hair and tight leather pants, his Gibson Les Paul slung low across his hips. He launched into a blistering version of Crossroads, his fingers flying across the fretboard with mechanical precision. Every note was perfect, every bend executed with textbook accuracy. The crowd ate it up. Jimi watched him passively, his face revealing nothing. But inside, he was analyzing every note, every phrase, every choice Morrison made. Technical proficiency? Absolutely. Speed? Impressive. But something was missing. There was no soul, no pain, no joy. It was like watching a very talented robot play guitar. All technique, no heart. After Morrison's set, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy in the room remained electric. Musicians clustered in small groups, discussing what they'd just witnessed. Morrison held court near the bar, surrounded by admirers and hangers-on, basking in the adulation. Jimi stood up, guitar case in hand, and began making his way through the crowd toward the stage. His manager, Chas Chandler, grabbed his arm. "Jimi, what are you doing?" "I'm going to play," Jimi said simply, his voice soft but determined. "You can't just." But Jimi was already moving, weaving through the crowd with his guitar case. He approached the stage manager, a heavy-set man named Tony who'd seen 1,000 guitarists come and go through this venue. "I'd like to sit in," Jimi said quietly. Tony looked him up and down, taking in the wild hair, the colorful scarf, the velvet jacket. "Who are you?" "Jimi Hendrix." The name meant nothing to Tony, but something in Jimi's eyes made him pause. Morrison doesn't usually let people sit in. "Ask him." Tony shrugged and walked over to Morrison, who was still surrounded by his entourage. The conversation was brief. Morrison glanced over at Jimi, a smirk playing across his lips. He said something that made his friends laugh, then nodded. Tony returned. "You got 5 minutes. Don't embarrass yourself." Jimi nodded and began unpacking his white Fender Stratocaster, the one he'd nicknamed Betty Jean. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, plugging in, adjusting the amp settings. The crowd, sensing something was about to happen, began to quiet down and drift back toward the stage. Morrison leaned against the bar, arms crossed, that same smirk on his face. He'd seen 100 guitarists try to challenge him, and he'd outplayed them all. This would be no different. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think is going to happen next. Jimi stepped onto the small stage, his Stratocaster hanging from his shoulder like a natural extension of his body. The stage lights caught the glossy white finish of the guitar, making it seem to glow in the smoky darkness. He didn't say anything to the crowd, didn't introduce himself or explain what he was about to do. He simply closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, a slow, bluesy bend that seemed to hang in the air like a question. Then another note, this one with more conviction, more feeling. Jimi's face transformed as he played, his features contorting with the emotion he was channeling through his instrument. It was as if the guitar was speaking, telling a story of pain and longing and hope. The crowd, which had been chattering and moving about, began to still. One by one, conversations died mid-sentence as people turned toward the stage. There was something hypnotic about the way Jimi played, something that demanded attention. He was playing Red House, a slow blues that he'd written himself, but he was playing it in a way that seemed to redefine what the blues could be. His fingers found notes that shouldn't have existed, bent strings in ways that seemed to defy physics. The sound coming from his amplifier was thick and rich, with a distortion that wasn't harsh but rather warm and enveloping, like honey mixed with fire. Morrison's smirk began to fade. He pushed off from the bar and moved closer to the stage, his eyes narrowing as he watched Jimi's hands. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't some hack trying to play fast and failing. This was something else entirely. Jimi's solo built slowly, each phrase more intense than the last. He wasn't showing off. There were no unnecessary runs or flashy tricks. Every note served the song. Every bend told part of the story. But the technical mastery was undeniable. His vibrato was perfect, his timing impeccable. He played behind the beat in a way that created tension, then released it with perfectly placed phrases that made the crowd gasp. Then, without warning, Jimi shifted gears. The slow blues transformed into something faster, more aggressive. His right hand became a blur as he played rapid-fire runs up and down the neck. But unlike Morrison's mechanical precision, Jimi's speed had feeling behind it. Each note mattered. Each phrase had purpose. He began to incorporate techniques that the crowd had never seen before. He played with his teeth, yes, but not as a gimmick. He was actually playing real notes, real melodies, while the guitar was in his mouth. He played behind his back, his fingers finding the frets without looking, never missing a note. He used feedback from the amplifier, controlling it and shaping it into musical phrases that sounded like the guitar was crying or screaming or laughing. The crowd was transfixed. Some people had their mouths hanging open. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. A few musicians in the audience looked like they wanted to pack up their instruments and quit right there. Morrison stood 10 feet from the stage, his arms no longer crossed, his face pale. He was watching a master at work, and he knew it. Everything he'd said about gimmicks and circus tricks evaporated in the face of what he was witnessing. This wasn't a gimmick. This was genius. Jimi brought the song to a climax, his guitar screaming and wailing, feedback and melody intertwining in a way that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Then, suddenly, he brought it all back down to that soft, bluesy beginning, closing the circle. The final note hung in the air, sustained and vibrating, slowly fading into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was absolute. Then the room exploded. People were shouting, applauding, stomping their feet. Musicians were shaking their heads in amazement. Someone yelled, "Holy shit!" And it seemed to sum up what everyone was feeling. Jimi opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd, his expression unchanged. He unplugged his guitar calmly, as if what he'd just done was the most natural thing in the world. As he stepped off the stage, people reached out to touch him, to shake his hand, to say something, anything, to him. But Jimi walked straight toward Randy Morrison. The crowd sensed what was happening and parted like the Red Sea. Morrison stood his ground, but there was something different in his eyes now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been respect, or fear, or both. Jimi stopped directly in front of him, so close they were almost touching. The room had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear what would be said. "You play well," Jimi said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got technique. You've got speed." Morrison nodded, unsure where this was going. Jimi leaned in closer, his eyes boring into Morrison's. When he spoke again, his voice was still soft, but there was steel underneath it. "But I'm better than you'll ever be." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. It wasn't said with anger or malice. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? He'd just witnessed the truth of Jimi's statement with his own eyes and ears. Jimi held his gaze for another moment, then turned and walked toward the exit, his guitar case in hand. The crowd parted for him again, and as he passed, people reached out to touch him, as if he were some kind of prophet or saint. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next in this incredible story. The news of what happened at the Café Wa that night spread through Greenwich Village like wildfire. By the next morning, every musician in New York seemed to know about it. The story grew with each telling. Some said Jimi had played for an hour. Others claimed Morrison had walked out in tears. Still others insisted that Jimi had literally broken strings with the intensity of his playing and kept going without missing a note. The truth was dramatic enough without embellishment, but that's not how legends work. They need to be bigger than life, and Jimi Hendrix was quickly becoming exactly that. Randy Morrison didn't show up for his next scheduled gig at the bitter end, or the one after that. Word on the street was that he'd locked himself in his apartment, refusing to see anyone. Some of his friends tried to reach out to tell him that it wasn't that bad, that he was still a great guitarist. But Morrison knew the truth. He'd been exposed. All his technical proficiency, all his speed and precision, had been revealed for what it was: empty virtuosity without soul. Jimi, meanwhile, continued his residency at the Café Wa, playing multiple sets a night to increasingly packed crowds. Club owners from across the city came to see what the fuss was about, and they left as converts, spreading the word further. Record executives started showing up, sensing that something special was happening. But Jimi remained unchanged by the attention. He was polite but distant with the industry people, more interested in the music than the business. Between sets, he'd sit in the back corner, smoking cigarettes and talking quietly with other musicians about technique, about tone, about the emotional truth that music could convey. One night, about a week after the confrontation, Jimi was sitting in his usual spot when someone slid into the seat across from him. He looked up to find Randy Morrison. Morrison looked different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something humbler, more genuine. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked like he hadn't slept much. "Can we talk?" Morrison asked. Jimi nodded, gesturing to the seat Morrison had already taken. For a long moment, Morrison just sat there, staring at his hands. Finally, he spoke. "I've been playing guitar since I was 6 years old. Practiced 8 hours a day, every day. Learned every technique, every scale, every mode. I thought that's what it was about, being the fastest, the most technically perfect." He looked up at Jimi. "But watching you play, I realized I've been doing it all wrong. You're not just playing notes. You're saying something. Every phrase means something. And I don't know how to do that." Jimi lit a cigarette, taking his time before responding. "Technique is important," he said finally. "But it's just the language. You've learned the words, but you haven't figured out what you want to say yet. How do I learn that? You don't learn it. You live it. You feel it. Every note has to come from somewhere real inside you. Pain, joy, anger, love, whatever it is, it has to be true. Otherwise, you're just making noise." Morrison nodded slowly, absorbing this. "What I said in that interview, about gimmicks and circus tricks, I was wrong. I'm sorry." Jimi shrugged. "You didn't know? Now you do. Can you teach me?" Jimi smiled slightly. "I can't teach you how to feel, man. That's something you have to figure out yourself. But I can show you some things about tone, about phrasing, about how to let the guitar speak instead of just making it perform." Over the next few weeks, an unlikely friendship developed between the two guitarists. Morrison would come to the Café Wa early, before Jimi's sets, and they'd sit together, guitars in hand, exploring sounds and ideas. Jimi showed Morrison how to use feedback musically, how to bend strings to create emotion, how to play with dynamics to build tension and release. But more importantly, Jimi talked to Morrison about life, about experience, about the blues and where it came from. He talked about pain and struggle, about the Black experience in America, about how music could be a form of resistance and survival. He talked about Muddy Waters and B.B. King, about Robert Johnson and the Devil at the Crossroads, about the tradition Morrison was trying to play without understanding. The blues isn't just a musical form. Jimi explained one night. It's a way of transforming pain into something beautiful. It's about taking the worst things in life and making them bearable by turning them into art. You can learn the notes, but if you haven't felt the pain, you're just imitating. Morrison listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his life. He began to understand that his technical mastery was just the beginning, not the end. He started playing differently, trying to put feeling into his phrases instead of just executing them perfectly. It was harder than anything he'd ever attempted, and at first, he was terrible at it. But slowly, gradually, something began to change in his playing. The other musicians in the village noticed. Morrison's playing became less flashy, but more moving. He stopped trying to be the fastest and started trying to be the most honest. He'd never be Jimi Hendrix. Nobody could be. But he was becoming himself, finding his own voice. If this story is resonating with you, please like this video and comment below about a time when someone challenged you to be better. 3 months after that fateful night at the Café Wa, Jimi Hendrix played his first major concert at the Monterey Pop Festival. He closed his set by setting his guitar on fire, smashing it, and walking off stage, leaving the audience in stunned silence before they erupted into the most thunderous applause of the entire festival. The performance was captured on film and became legendary, cementing Jimi's status as the most innovative and exciting guitarist in the world. Randy Morrison was in the audience that day, watching from the side of the stage. As Jimi walked past him after the performance, Morrison grabbed his arm. "Thank you," Morrison said simply. Jimi nodded, understanding everything that was contained in those 2 words. Morrison never became as famous as Jimi Hendrix. Few people did, but he carved out a respectable career as a session musician and eventually as a guitar teacher. He became known for his ability to help students find their own voice on the instrument, to play with feeling rather than just technique. He always credited one person with teaching him the most important lesson of his musical life. "Jimi Hendrix told me he was better than I'd ever be," Morrison would say in interviews years later. And he was right. But he also showed me that being the best wasn't the point. Finding your truth and expressing it, that was the point. I spent years trying to be the fastest, the most technical, the most impressive. Jimi taught me to try to be the most honest instead. The story of that night at the Café Wa became part of rock and roll mythology. Like all legends, it grew in the telling, acquiring details that may or may not have been true. But the core of the story remained. The night a young guitarist from Seattle, by way of London, walked into a Greenwich Village club and changed everything. Jimi Hendrix went on to revolutionize rock music, expanding the possibilities of the electric guitar in ways that are still being explored today. His career was tragically short. He died in 1970 at the age of 27, but his influence was immeasurable. Every guitarist who came after him had to contend with what he'd done, with the bar he'd set. But perhaps his most important legacy wasn't the technical innovations or the famous performances. It was the lesson he taught Randy Morrison and countless others. That technique without soul is meaningless. That speed without purpose is just noise. That being the best means nothing if you have nothing to say. In the years after Jimi's death, Morrison would sometimes play Red House in his sets, the same song Jimi had played that night. He never tried to replicate Jimi's version. That would have been missing the point entirely. Instead, he played it his own way, putting his own feelings and experiences into it, trying to honor the lesson he'd learned. The Café Wa still stands in Greenwich Village, though it's changed ownership many times over the years. On the wall, there's a plaque commemorating the many famous musicians who played there in the 1960s. Jimi Hendrix's name is on that plaque, along with Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, and others who went on to change music history. But there's no plaque for Randy Morrison, and he wouldn't want one. His contribution wasn't to music history, but to the understanding of what music could be. He took the lesson Jimi taught him and passed it on to his students, who passed it on to theirs, creating a ripple effect that continues to this day. The confrontation between Jimi Hendrix and Randy Morrison wasn't really about who was the better guitarist. It was about the difference between playing guitar and making music, between technical mastery and emotional truth, between performing and communicating. Jimi understood this instinctively. Morrison had to learn it the hard way. "I'm better than you'll ever be." Those words, delivered with quiet certainty in a smoke-filled basement club in 1966, contained a truth that went beyond simple comparison. Jimi wasn't just saying he was more talented or more skilled. He was saying he understood something fundamental about music that Morrison didn't. And in that moment, Morrison realized he was right. But the story doesn't end with Morrison's defeat. It ends with his transformation. Because the real lesson of that night wasn't about winning or losing, about being the best or accepting you're not. It was about understanding what music is really for, not to impress people with your technical ability, but to communicate something true and human, to connect with people on a level deeper than words can reach. Jimi Hendrix knew this. He lived it every time he picked up his guitar. And on that August night in 1966, he taught it to Randy Morrison and everyone else in that room. Some learned the lesson immediately. Others took years to understand it. Some never got it at all. But for those who did understand, who really heard what Jimi was saying through his guitar that night, it changed everything. It changed how they listened to music, how they played music, how they thought about what music could be and do. That's the real legacy of that night at the Café Wah. Not the confrontation, not the put down, not even the incredible guitar playing. The legacy is the lesson that true mastery isn't about being better than everyone else. It's about being true to yourself and expressing that truth in a way that touches other people's souls. Jimi Hendrix was better than Randy Morrison would ever be. But more importantly, Jimi Hendrix was more himself than Morrison had ever been. And that made all the difference. Thank you so much for reading this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments what other music legends you'd like to hear stories about. Your support means everything.